Good morning and welcome to our Bible study today from John's amazing Gospel. For today and our next talk, we will be looking at the final chapter of John's Gospel. Many people love John's Gospel because it's a lifetime's reflection and prayers put in a way that make Jesus real and full of warmth and light and promise. But context is so important, as we know, both what's before and what's after a passage. And this chapter comes after Jesus has risen from the dead and before he ascended. So without further ado, the first 14 verses of John chapter 21. After this, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. This is how he showed himself. Simon Peter, Thomas known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples were all together. Simon Peter spoke up. "I'm going fishing," he said. "We'll go with you," they replied. So they went off and got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. A storm was breaking. Jesus stood beside the seashore, but the disciples didn't know it was Jesus. "Children," said Jesus to them, "haven't you got anything to eat?" "No," they replied. "Cast the net on the right side of the boat," he said, "and you'll find something." So they cast the net, and now they couldn't draw it in because of the weight of the fish. So the disciple that Jesus loved spoke to Peter. "It's the Master," he said. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Master, he wrapped his cloak around him. He'd been naked for work, and threw himself into the sea. The other disciples brought the boat into the land, dragging the net full of fish. They weren't far from shore, about 100 yards away. When they came to land, they saw a charcoal fire laid there, with fish and bread on it. Jesus spoke to them. "Bring some of the fish you just caught," he said. So Simon Peter went and pulled the net onto the shore. It was full of large fish, 153 in all. The net wasn't torn, even though there were so many. "Come and have breakfast," said Jesus to them. None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Master. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and so also with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus had appeared to the disciples after he'd been raised from the dead. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So what should the disciples do whilst they're waiting after the resurrection? Time seems to stand still. The distress of the cross is still there, but the huge excitement of the resurrection and of what is to come is the principal emotion. 7 of the disciples are together by the Sea of Tiberias, and Peter makes his mind up to go fishing. After all, it's something to do, and it's what Peter did for a living before he met Jesus, as well as some of the disciples also. And the other disciples join him. But what a damp squib. They fish all night and catch nothing. Nothing at all after all those hours. And then there's this irritating fellow on the beach who seems to know that they haven't caught anything, and he knows this close to shore, and it must have been close to shore, we know 100 yards, to hear his voice in the boat, just where to fish. Jesus says, "Put the net down on the other side of the boat." How daft is that? Are the fish really hiding on the other side of this small boat? And of course they are. But notice that Jesus is introduced to this story as the sun rises. John wants us to realize that Jesus brings light into the world, which includes, in this instance, where to fish. Notice too that it's John who recognizes that it's Jesus. It so reminds me of that incident on the Emmaus Road where 2 disciples suddenly recognize that it is the risen Jesus. We don't know what it is about Jesus' resurrection body that means that even though the disciples who'd spent every day with him for 3 years, they couldn't recognize him immediately. But it's just one of those mysteries that go with this exciting one-off story. So John recognizes Jesus. And what does Peter do? Help the others to land the huge catch? No, of course not. He puts his cloak on and jumps in the sea, leaving the others to do the hard work. And it's hard, isn't it, sometimes? But we shouldn't begrudge the Peters of this world who are so excited by Jesus that they leave others in their wake to do the tidying up and the making of tea and the clearing of tables. Sometimes it feels like we're being put upon, but Jesus recognizes what we do and loves us for it, whether we are Peters or Johns or any of the disciples. It's worth just thinking about what the disciples were to do. They were to go into the world filled with God and do Jesus' work. But if they did it in their own strength, they would fail. They would work and struggle and put effort in all night, and nothing would work. What they needed was to stop and hear Jesus, to hear his voice, and then anything is possible. Remember chapter 15 of John, verse 5, which says, where the true vine says, apart from me, you can do nothing. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Are there things which you and I are struggling over and getting nowhere? What the passage shows is that we need to wait for the dawn and watch for that person on the shore and do whatever he says. Then he will bring in the fish. Or to change metaphors, it will help us bear fruit, the fruit of love, joy, peace, great-heartedness, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, as Paul writes to the Galatians. Now here's a puzzle. Once the disciples reach the shore, they find a fire with bread and fish. How do the fish get there? Clearly not sufficient fish for them all, so they need a few more. So Peter goes off to drag the whole net in. They only needed 8 of the large fish, not 153. It's the generosity of God filled up and overflowing. And we all hear those lovely words, come and have breakfast. Come and have breakfast. Sometimes in our rush to save resources, we miss our generous God who provides so much more than we need. Now let's just imagine what this scene was like. The beach is just warming up with the sun. You can feel the sand between your toes. A breeze is blowing off the lake, and you have that lovely watery smell. But also you have the smell of charcoal burning. And Peter was struggling with the memory of getting things wrong in the high priest's courtyard, where there were charcoal burners, the same smell. It must have been rushing back into Peter, all those thoughts of denying that he was one of Jesus' followers 3 times. Sometimes we remember events, both good and bad, from the past because of smell or because of a sound. And I'm sure that this was true for Peter. Jesus didn't need the disciples' catch, their catch of fish, and he doesn't need ours, and we don't have to do it all. We are so often told, aren't we, that he has no hands but ours. That's total rubbish. It's not true. Who made the sun rise, the flowers bloom, the crops ripen? Jesus welcomes our work. He asks Peter to bring some of his catch, but Jesus doesn't need it. Yes, we should work hard in God's service, but thankfully Jesus is in charge and we should trust him. In this whole wonderful new world, God will always surprise us. Next time, we'll look at the final part of this wonderful passage and glorious gospel. Have a wonderful